The story of Sir Isaac Newton and the South Sea Bubble is just too good to be true, and it might be. The legend goes that in 1720, one of the greatest minds in human history was taken to the cleaners. Newton, the father of modern physics, had stared into the machinery of the cosmos, but when faced with a booming stock, he proved to be painfully human.
As the story is told, he invested early, sold his shares for a staggering £7,000 profit, and walked away a rich man. But then, he watched in agony as the stock kept climbing. Friends who'd held on were becoming fantastically wealthy. The fear of missing out became too much to bear. Newton, supposedly, jumped back in at the absolute peak of the market. Then the bubble burst and he lost a fortune, said to be £20,000, a sum worth millions today. While solid proof of this spectacular loss is hard to come by, the episode is forever linked to his bitter quote, "I can calculate the motion of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." That madness had a name, the South Sea Company, and its collapse would push the entire British Empire to the brink. To understand the madness, you have to understand the desperation. It's the early 1700s. Britain is a nation drowning in debt after the long and ruinously expensive War of the Spanish Succession. The national debt was a colossal figure, tens of millions of pounds, a sum so large the government had no realistic plan to ever pay it back. Britain needed a miracle. And then one was offered. The architects were a politician, Robert Harley, and a brilliant, ruthless financier named John Blunt. Their proposal was audacious. They would create a new public-private partnership, the South Sea Company. This company would perform a sort of financial alchemy. It would take on huge chunks of Britain's national debt. In exchange, the government would pay the company a steady 6% interest on that debt, which would then be used to pay dividends to its new shareholders. But the real prize, the detail that set imaginations on fire, was a monopoly. The South Sea Company was granted the exclusive right to trade with South America. The name itself was a marketing masterstroke, conjuring images of endless gold and silver just waiting to be plucked from the Spanish colonies. The pitch included the Asiento de Negros, a monstrously lucrative contract to supply Spanish America with 4,800 enslaved Africans every year for 30 years. In an age that viewed the slave trade as a pillar of the economy, this alone seemed to guarantee success. To lend it all an unimpeachable air of authority, King George I himself became the company's governor in 1718, its most prominent shareholder and figurehead. With royalty on board, how could it possibly fail? The reality, of course, was a world away from the fantasy. The so-called monopoly was far more limited than advertised. Spain placed heavy taxes on British ships and, beyond the slave trade, only permitted them to send one single trading vessel per year. The vast profits from trade were a mirage. The actual business of the South Sea Company was almost non-existent. Its true product was hype. For a few years, the company coasted, but in 1719, John Blunt went for the kill. He proposed that the company take over the vast majority of Britain's remaining national debt, a sum of over £30 million. This time, they had a rival, the deeply established Bank of England. The battle for the deal wasn't fought with ledgers, it was fought with bribes. To get the South Sea Act through Parliament, the company's directors secretly gifted shares and offered them on credit to powerful men. Members of Parliament, government ministers, and even the King's mistress were all cut in on a sure thing. Their support was bought and paid for with the promise of guaranteed riches. With Parliament secured, the mania began. The stock, trading at £128 per share in January 1720, exploded. It hit £330 in March and surged past £550 in May. London's financial district, Exchange Alley, became a scene of pandemonium. lords and ladies rubbed shoulders with merchants and farmers, all desperate to buy. Fortunes were being made in hours, not years. The fever was contagious. Hundreds of new bubble companies popped up, hoping to catch a ride on the wave of investor cash. Some were for plausible ventures. Many were utterly absurd. One company was formed for extracting silver from lead, another for trading in human hair. The most famous was a venture advertised as being for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. The promoter reportedly took in £2,000 in a single morning, then promptly vanished. But at the heart of it all was the South Sea Company. To keep the stock rising, John Blunt devised another scheme. The company began lending people money to buy more of its own stock. People mortgaged their homes, borrowing against the very shares they were buying to buy even more. By August 1720, a single share of South Sea stock peaked at over £1,000. The company's paper valuation was so astronomical, some claimed it was worth more than twice all the land in England. Every bubble eventually finds a pin. In its arrogance, the South Sea Company provided its own. To stamp out its rivals, the company pushed Parliament to pass the Bubble Act in June 1720, a law designed to shut down its competitors. The move backfired spectacularly. Prosecuting the smaller bubble companies triggered a wave of panic. As their stocks collapsed, ruined investors had to sell other assets to cover their losses. And the first stock they sold was their most valuable, South Sea. At the same time, company insiders, the very men who engineered the boom, saw the writing on the wall. They began to quietly sell their shares. The trickle became a flood. The company's loan scheme, once a brilliant accelerator, was now a time bomb. As payments came due, investors who had borrowed to buy at the top couldn't pay. Their only option was to sell. The herd psychology that had driven the price to insane heights now went into brutal reverse. Panic replaced greed. The sell-off became a stampede. The share price, which had topped £1,000 in August, collapsed. By the end of September, it was £150. By December, it was back where it started, at £124. The ruin was absolute. Families who had considered themselves wealthy just weeks before were now bankrupt. Suicides were widely reported. The life savings of thousands, from aristocrats to shopkeepers, had vanished. Public outrage was volcanic. Protesters filled the streets, demanding justice. The financial system of one of the most powerful nations on earth was on the verge of collapse. The fallout was a national crisis. Parliament launched an investigation and uncovered a vast web of corruption reaching the highest levels of government. Company directors were arrested. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Islaby, was found guilty of the most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption, expelled from Parliament and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The estates of the company directors were confiscated to compensate victims. But the government had a dilemma. A full accounting would expose the complicity of the king's inner circle, potentially destabilizing the entire political order. They needed a fixer. That man was Robert Walpole. A shrewd politician, Walpole had publicly warned against the scheme and had cleverly cashed out his own shares early. He now stepped into the chaos. He implemented a rescue package to stabilize the system and restore public credit. He carefully managed the investigation, punishing the worst offenders while shielding the political establishment from total ruin. For this, his enemies gave him a nickname, the Screenmaster General. Walpole's masterful handling of the crisis made him the most powerful man in the country. He became Britain's first Lord of the Treasury in 1721 and would dominate politics for the next 2 decades, effectively becoming Britain's first Prime Minister. The legacy of the South Sea Bubble was deep. The Bubble Act, ironically, remained on the books for a century, and some historians argue it stifled corporate innovation in the run-up to the Industrial Revolution. Public trust in financial markets was shattered for a generation. The very words stock jobbing became synonymous with fraud. The company itself, a hollowed-out shell, limped on until it was finally dissolved in the 1850s. The South Sea bubble stands as a timeless monument to speculation. It was a perfect storm of government debt, corporate greed, political corruption, and mass hysteria. It showed how easily the promise of effortless riches can short-circuit the rational minds of an entire nation. 300 years later, the story feels eerily familiar. The names change, from South Sea shares to dot-com stocks, from housing derivatives to cryptocurrency. But the psychology remains the same. Newton could calculate the motion of the heavenly bodies. He never did figure out the madness of people. Neither, it turns out, have we. If you found this story of financial catastrophe and political intrigue compelling, subscribe for more explorations into the collapses that have shaped our history. And let us know in the comments which historical bubble you'd like us to dissect next.